A group of people in suits and police uniforms sit in a briefing room. At the front of the room is an older, distinguished-looking person in a suit looking stern and serious. Based on the sophisticated nature of the disposal site and the lack of forensic evidence, we believe we are looking for a disorganized, atypical offender. The unsub isn't motivated by financial gain or sudden rage. He is motivated by control. By choosing victims who are high-functioning and successful, he is attempting to reclaim a sense of power he lacks in his own life. He is likely a social chameleon. Expect someone who holds a steady, low-level job, perhaps in maintenance or delivery, which allows him to move through neighborhoods unnoticed. The placement of the sentimental item at each scene isn't an apology. It's a trophy. He's reliving the win long after the act is over. We're looking for a male in his late 20s to early 30s. He likely lives alone or with a submissive parental figure. His home will be meticulously clean, contrasting the chaos of his crime scenes. A recent stressor, likely a professional rejection or the loss of a primary relationship, has caused him to decompensate, shortening his cooling-off period. We've seen scenes like this play out in television series like Criminal Minds time and time again, and experience the intrigue and thrill as the suspect is caught thanks to the brilliant profile put together by the criminal profiler. Not surprisingly, this has led to a huge number of people flocking to the psychology field. I mean, who wouldn't want to know how to examine the evidence, compile a psychological profile, and race out to take some horrible person off the streets and put them behind bars where they belong? But is any of it real? How many forensic psychology students actually get to work as profilers? And what about the graduates that don't make it into being a profiler? What kind of jobs can they expect to get? Find out today on Your Mind on Forensic Psychology. Welcome back, everyone, to another week here on the Your Mind On podcast. I hope you've all had a great week, and Merry Christmas to those that celebrate. No matter what you celebrate, I hope you're having a fantastic holiday season. If you're listening to this on the day it comes out, thank you for choosing to spend a part of your Christmas day with me. And if this is your first time listening in, welcome. I hope you enjoy the episode, learn something new along the way, and hopefully stick around for more. This week, we're hitting our gateway episode. This is a big, interesting segment of psychology that I've been wanting to dip my toes into on the podcast, but in good conscience, I couldn't cover any of it until I addressed the elephant in the room. So, here we are. Forensic psychology. As I described in the intro, we've seen this in movies and television series like Criminal Minds. It's always fascinating to watch the characters work diligently to build a profile, chase down the suspect, and then offer the big reveal of how eerily accurate the profile was, often having noted things that other investigators missed. When I was working on my undergraduate degree in psychology, the class I took on forensic psychology probably had more students in it than any other psychology class I took. This branch of psychology draws a huge crowd as everyone seems to be captivated by the subject. So what is forensic psychology? How's it defined? The American Psychological Association, or APA, defines forensic psychology as the professional practice by psychologists within the areas of clinical psychology, counseling psychology, school psychology, or other specialty in psychology where they engage primarily as experts and consultants within the judicial and legal systems. I think most people tend to believe that forensic psychology is all about building psychological profiles of kidnappers, serial killers, and other violent criminals to help law enforcement catch them, often being right there in the thick of things when the suspect is caught. However, in reality, profiling is the smallest segment of what forensic psychologists do. In fact, while no exact census exists, It is estimated that fewer than 1 to 2% of forensic psychologists work as profilers. So let's take a look at what they actually do for work. Unlike therapists, whose primary goal is to help a patient, forensic psychologists' main client is the court system. There are 5 main responsibilities that these psychologists have. First is competency evaluation. Have you ever heard of a court case where the accused person is deemed unfit to stand trial? When someone is accused of a crime and their lawyer uses the defense that the defendant is mentally unfit to stand trial, the court appoints a psychologist to interview and evaluate the defendant to find out if they understand what they've been charged with, if they understand right from wrong, and so on. These psychologists are forensic psychologists. The next role is as an expert witness. I'm sure everyone has seen this at one point in time or another, particularly in court cases where someone's defense is related to past traumas. The job of the psychological expert witness is to explain complex psychological concepts to the judge and jury and how these concepts might or might not be related to the crime and the defendant. Forensic psychologists also provide risk assessments. Essentially, they provide a psychological evaluation to determine the likelihood that someone will commit another crime, most often conducted during parole hearings. Forensic psychologists are also often brought in as trial consultants to help with jury selection or to help build a strategy for the trial based on how people perceive information. Here again, we have another Hollywood portrayal of forensic psychology. If you've ever seen the series Bull, that is essentially someone working in this trial consultant role, but just like with Criminal Minds, it's greatly exaggerated. In this series, Bull uses mirror juries during the trial to get a feel for how things are going. This is almost never done in real life, as it is wildly expensive and it's a logistical nightmare. Bull also has his team hack into jurors' social media accounts, home computers, or even plant bugs. This is highly illegal, as it would be jury tampering. And then there's Bull's uncanny ability to simply look at a juror's shoes and know exactly how they will vote, which is more psychic than psychologic. Real forensic psychologists use focus groups, mock trials, help identify biases in jurors that might affect the verdict, and help coach witnesses on body language and posture before they take the stand to make sure that they get their message across properly. And that brings us to the last major function of forensic psychologists. For anyone considering forensic psychology based on shows like Criminal Minds that want to conduct interviews, build profiles, and experience the thrill of danger, this last function has all of that, but in some ways it could be even more dangerous. Forensic psychologists are often brought in during child custody hearings to interview and evaluate each person involved, parents, children, and anyone else with stake in the custody hearing like guardians, grandparents, and so on. The forensic psychology professor I had in my undergrad studies said that he is frequently used in this capacity and that it can be extremely dangerous. When your job is to interview people and do a psychological evaluation and then recommend to the judge and the court system which parent or guardian should have primary custody, let alone sole custody, of children, people tend to get pretty upset. He said that in the years that he has done that kind of work, he's had his tires slashed, his office had bomb threats, he's been stalked, and even received death threats. Of course, these kind of actions come from the parent that was not recommended for custody, and it kind of proves the point of why they were not recommended. Based on these typical roles of forensic psychologists, there is very little in common with the televised version of forensic psychologists. But there is a unit of the FBI called the Behavioral Analysis Unit, just like on Criminal Minds, and this is one of the places where that small minority of forensic psychologists work. So these are the elite psychologists that fly in private jets and chase down bad guys, right? Well, no, not really. Most forensic psychologists hired by the FBI do not hold the role of profiler, but rather are special agents. After working as special agents for a long period of time, they can then apply to the Behavioral Analysis Unit. Their main functions are to review crime scene photos, victimology, and forensic reports to identify offender traits, design specific questioning techniques based on the suspect's personality type to encourage a confession, and to evaluate lone actor threats, such as potential school shooters or domestic terrorists, to determine if they are moving from ideation to action. These agents rarely, if ever, are in the field. Most of their time, roughly 90%, is spent at a computer doing paperwork. They also do not typically resolve investigations as quickly as on television. In the Criminal Minds series, they usually have everything wrapped up with a neat bow within about a week or so, but in reality, these kind of investigations take weeks, months, and possibly even years to resolve. So aside from the fact that Hollywood thrives on fictionalizing life to make media more entertaining and thrilling, why is there such a huge discrepancy? Well, for starters, they have actually blended two different areas of psychology: forensic psychology and criminal psychology. Forensic psychology focuses on the legal applications. What is the person's mental state now in relation to the law, and can they be held responsible for their actions? Criminal psychology focuses on the why. Why did the person commit the crime? What psychological factors led to this? Criminal psychology is more closely aligned with the television portrayal of profilers, but they still do not lead the action-packed criminal capturing lives of their television counterparts. Who is it that actually does the profiling and apprehending then? Well, a forensic psychologist might be called in to review and consult on a profile that has been created, but that's more of a side task for them. The real profiling and investigative work is done by everyday law enforcement officers. Now, you might be a little confused by this because how could your typical patrolman or detective create such a complex psychological profile? And the answer is statistics. Most things that show up in profiles on shows like Criminal Minds are based in statistical analysis. Decades of crime statistics and experience offer insights into the probability of traits a criminal might have, as well as simple logic. If you've watched the show, there certainly have been times where they start discussing the profile and you've thought to yourself, yes, obviously, I knew that. And you weren't wrong. You likely haven't had years of psychological training and experience that the characters in the show have, yet you came to the same conclusions about the suspect that they did. This is a ratings tactic. The production companies rely on engagement to keep viewership. So if they make you feel like you're as smart as the crack FBI agents, you're more likely to keep watching because you feel like you're a part of the team. They basically take simple logic and statistics and package them as complex profiles. The bottom line with all of this is that while psychological profiles might act as a guide for investigation, they are nothing more than a guide. Profiles like this are regarded as very subjective, and in fact, they cannot be used as evidence in court. The reason the public tends to have a high faith in profiling is referred to as the criminal profiling illusion, largely boosted by fictional media. There is no compelling scientific evidence that criminal profiling is a reliable or valid investigative tool. Research indicates that professional profilers often produce predictions that are not significantly more accurate than those made by non-professionals. The FBI's organized-disorganized dichotomy, a core concept in serial killer profiling, was developed from interviews with real offenders, but it's actually failed to hold up under empirical scrutiny. Studies of serial murderers found no distinct subsets of behavior that easily categorize these killers as strictly organized or disorganized. The belief that profiling works is often built on vivid anecdotes. However, these success stories often omit critical facts such as what evidence actually led to an arrest. Researching real life criminals is essential for the actual field of psychology, however. Real analysts study serial killers to identify overlapping personality traits, adding to a larger body of work that future psychologists use to understand and potentially predict future criminal behavior. And surprisingly, the show's use of analytic patterns to narrow down suspect pools is considered well researched and reflects how real behavioral analysis, a relatively modern technique, is applied in the field. And so now that we've covered forensic psychology and what it really is, and how it's different from what's portrayed by Hollywood, why did I feel this episode was necessary? One of the aspects of psychology that I enjoy the most, and I know I'm not alone here, is understanding the minds of people, especially those who've done horrific things. We're often intrigued when something or someone acts outside of expected patterns. So we have a morbid curiosity when it comes to dark minds, and I've wanted to cater to that to some degree, as well as covering the psychological aspects of some of the most well-known serial killers. And as a Christmas treat, you don't have to wait for a future episode for the first one. We're going to jump right in and cover the first one now. To preface this, along with all future ones we cover, this is not a true crime podcast. I'm not going to be presenting this as a true crime story. I will not be going in depth with the crimes that these people have committed, but I will instead be focusing on the psychology that may have influenced or contributed to their actions. Some crimes may be mentioned in passing, but I'm not going to be going into any graphic detail. So for our first in-depth look at a dark mind, we will be looking at the co-ed killer, Edmund Kemper. If you want a more in-depth look at Kemper and a more detailed description of his crimes, he's been thoroughly covered on a lot of other podcasts. I personally would highly recommend checking out episode 123 of Dan Cummins' podcast Timesuck. He does a phenomenal job of covering the ghoulish crimes while breaking up the darkness with a little bit of dark humor here and there. I would also like to make it very, very clear. Not everyone that experiences the same traumas or has the same psychological disorders and conditions becomes a serial killer like Kemper, or even a violent person. There is no exact recipe that turns someone into a serial killer. As we covered earlier in the podcast, profiling a criminal to use as an indicator of future actions can be unreliable. A conclusion powerfully illustrated by the case of Edmund Emil Kemper III. In 1972, after serving time for killing his grandparents as a teenager, Kemper was evaluated by 2 court-appointed psychiatrists and deemed not dangerous or otherwise a threat to society. It was later discovered that he had already murdered 6 women and would go on to kill his mother and her friend, and earning the moniker the co-ed killer. Edmund Kemper's violent trajectory was heavily dictated by a cycle of emotional and psychological abuse from his mother, Clarnell Kemper, combined with the trauma of abandonment by his father. This early environment created a volatile mix that shaped his later horrific actions. Kemper's mother was described as a dominant alcoholic who subjected him to constant emasculation and belittling, treating him as an inferior. This toxic relationship served as the primary catalyst for his violent tendencies. Key aspects of this abuse included psychological and physical isolation. At the age 8, his mother began locking him in a dark basement at night because she purportedly feared he would harm his sisters. Kemper recalled that his violent fantasies toward women began in that castle dungeon while he was terrified of the dark. Emasculation. Clarnell frequently berated Kemper in public and blamed him for her divorce. Kemper later stated that a mother's scorn and humiliation are direct pathways to a son becoming hostile, violent, and debased. Symbolic violence. Kemper viewed his murders of young women as a way to exert dominance and address feelings of inadequacy and frustration stemming from his mother's treatment. He often cited his desire for revenge against her as a driving factor in his crimes. Beyond maternal abuse, Kemper experienced significant trauma through parental rejection. After his parents' volatile marriage ended, his father abandoned the family. At age 14, Kemper ran away to find his father in California, only to be rejected and sent back, a crucial narcissistic injury from the one parent who might have provided a refuge. As a child, Kemper exhibited behaviors often linked to future violence, specifically extreme cruelty to animals, as a part of the MacDonald triad. At age 10, he killed the family cat and eventually began torturing and even decapitating neighborhood pets, storing their remains in his closet. Kemper's violent acts were often displaced aggression meant for his mother. At age 15, Kemper killed his grandparents, an act he later described as seeking revenge against his mother because his grandmother's personality reminded him of Clarnell's. After being released from a psychiatric institution, Kemper moved back in with his mother. He confessed that every time he got mad at her, he would go out and murder a stranger because he felt he could not battle her directly due to her verbal capabilities. The primary wound was only closed when Kemper murdered and decapitated his mother in 1973. Following this act and the murder of her friend, he turned himself in, stating that the violence had to stay between him and his mother, and that she finally had to die to stop the killing of other girls. Psychologically, Kemper suffered from vulnerable enmity, a trait where internal fragility and a fixation on a perceived rejection erupt into violence when the armor of a grandiose exterior fails. His trajectory illustrates how severe childhood trauma and maternal humiliation can transform a child into a walking time bomb, whose violence is a ritualistic attempt to repair deep narcissistic wounds. Kemper's development can be compared to a pressure cooker with a faulty valve. The constant heat of the maternal abuse and the clogged escape route of parental support allowed internal rage to build until it reached an explosive, lethal pressure that could only be vented through extreme violence. Throughout his periods of incarceration, Edmund Kemper has been assigned several clinical and psychological labels by various psychiatric experts and state panels. These diagnoses range from standard personality disorders to specific neurological conditions resulting from his declining health. In psychiatric evaluations conducted during his time in prison, most recently in 2017 and 2024, Kemper has been diagnosed with a trio of personality disorders. First is Antisocial Personality Disorder. This label reflects his long history of violating social norms and laws. Next is Narcissistic Personality Disorder. Evaluators noted that his egocentric stance, focus on domination or manipulation of others, and his being guided by superficial, grandiose delusions. The final one is Schizotypal Personality Disorder. This was applied due to his odd beliefs, fantasies, ongoing suspicions, and odd thoughts in speech. While his scores on the psychopathy checklist revised are noted to be above the mean for North American male inmates, they remain below the formal cutoff for psychopathic personality disorder. Additionally, he is diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, though it is classified as being a sustained remission while in prison. Recent forensic research published in 2025 used Kemper as a case study to define more nuanced dimensions of narcissism found in sexually motivated serial killers. Within this framework, Kemper is categorized by vulnerable enmity. This is his dominant trait, characterized by deep-seated hostility, paranoia, defensive hostility, and a fixation on perceived rejection. Second is grandiose admiration and rivalry. Labels describing his self-promotion, need to be seen as special, and his tendency to devalue others to assert supremacy. And then there's vulnerable isolation. This is descriptive of his social withdrawal and use of avoidance to protect a fragile self-esteem. As Kemper aged and following a stroke in 2015, new clinical labels have been applied. First is the Pseudobulbar Affect. Due to brain damage from his stroke, Kemper was diagnosed with PBA, which causes him to burst into laughter or crying inappropriately without relation to actual emotion. Another label applied has been sexual sadist. Forensic psychologists have labeled him a sexual sadist with an admitted history of necrophilia. He's also been labeled high risk to reoffend. Despite his status as a model prisoner, recent risk assessments continue to label him as high risk for future violence. And what may surprise some people, another label that has been assigned to Kemper is genius level intelligence. Prison records consistently label him with a very high IQ, recorded at a score of 145, which has been described as a genius-level trait that enabled his early manipulation of psychiatric staff. Psychologically, Kemper is seen as a fragile predator, a label used to describe the paradox of a man whose aggressive, grandiose exterior acts as armor for a core that is profoundly wounded and hypersensitive to rejection. He is essentially a walking time bomb whose internal script flips from powerless to a ritualistic, violent search for dominance when his armor fails. Ultimately, Edmund Kemper remains one of the most significant paradoxes in forensic history. He is a man of high-functioning devastation, a predator who could dismantle a human being with the same cold intellectual perception he used to dismantle a psychological evaluation. His case serves as a haunting reminder that a high IQ is not a shield against psychopathology, but rather a tool that can be used to camouflage it. By the time the heat in his internal pressure cooker finally breached the valve, Kemper had effectively fixed his primary wound through matricide, leaving him a hollow shell of a man who had no further reason to kill. Today, as he ages within the California medical facility, he remains a fragile predator in stasis, a living monument to the terrifying reality that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who can look you in the eye and explain exactly why they are broken. And there we have it. Forensic psychology and a psychological description of Ed, the co-ed killer, Kemper. I hope you've learned some new information here today and were fascinated, if not terrified, by the description of Kemper. Again, if you want to learn more about Kemper and his crime in details, check out Dan Cummins on Timesuck, episode 123. Just be careful. Timesuck can be a whirlpool of information that can suck you in, and you may find yourself binging throughout the catalog, just as I have been. But Dan is also a stand-up comedian, so his humor tends to get a little dark and a little strange. So if you're not prepared for that, or if that's not your thing, probably you should look elsewhere to find more information. Next week, we're shifting gears to look at a condition that is often talked about but rarely understood: bipolar disorder. We're going to step inside what it's actually like to live between two extremes, moving from the intense, high-energy rush of mania to the heavy, suffocating weight of a deep depression. It's more than just mood swings. It's a total shift in how the brain processes reality, energy, and risk. We'll talk about the science behind these cycles, clear up some common myths, and look at how the legal system handles cases where a person's mental health takes the driver's seat. Join us as we break down the reality of living on the bipolar spectrum. Don't forget to rate and leave a comment on your preferred podcast listening platform. I would really greatly appreciate it, as it helps the show grow tremendously. If you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions, you can reach out by sending an email to hello@yourmindonpodcast.com. Also, don't forget to follow the show on Instagram @yourmindonpodcast. You can also learn more about the show and about me on our website, yourmindonpodcast.com. I hope you have a great last week of the year. Once again, thank you for listening today. I'm John Shaw, and remember, understanding your mind is the first step to changing your life. Until next time, be kind to yourself.